Welcome everyone to this new episode of our vlog series. I am Alessandro Tacconelli, PhD candidate of the Center for Law and Economics here at ETH Zurich. Because of the lower burden of enforcement of fines compared to other types of sanctions and the transfer of wealth from the offender to the society, fines have been widely adopted as an efficient way of criminal sanctioning. In light of this, it does not come as a surprise that over the years, different fining regimes have been developed and executed in different legal systems. Among those, day fines have been proposed as an optimal way of ensuring substantial equality before the law across social classes. With those, the rich will not dismiss with ease the payment of pecuniary sanctions. The poor, on the other hand, will afford to pay fines. But what are those? And are the promises of day fines kept in practice? I'm very happy to have here with me today Professor Elena Kantorowicz-Reznichenko, Professor of Quantitative Empirical Legal Studies at the Erasmus University of Rotterdam, co-director of Erasmus Center of Empirical Legal Studies, and director of the European Doctorate in Law and Economics. With an interdisciplinary background, her research focuses on the experimental investigation of decision-making in the fields of constitutional law, administrative law, copyright law, and international criminal law. Today, we will be talking about the topic of day fines. Welcome, Elena.
Thank you for having me here.
So, Elena, before we dive into the core of our discussion, why don't you give us a brief definition of day fines and maybe explain to us how this regime is different from other existing models?
Yes. So in most countries, we use what can be called traditional fines, fixed fines, and the idea is that the fine is heavily dependent on the severity of the offense. Some countries suggest, well, we shouldn't ignore the income of the offender, so they gave some general prescription saying to the judge, you should take into account the financial circumstance of the offender. But it's not systematized. That means every judge can do it in its own way. Day fines basically create a system, a certain model, very strict one, which suggests how do you take into account, on the one hand, the severity, and on the other hand, the financial capacity. So it's basically decoupling those two things, assuming that income should not play a role. Income is irrelevant to a person's, in principle, offense. So what it does, you first determine the number of days of fine a person should pay, and the number depends on the severity of the offense, which means the harsher the offense, the larger is the number of the days you need to pay. And then what do you need to pay per day is determined by a fraction of your income, which means the fraction is the same for all offenders, and you always pay the same fraction of your income. And the idea behind this, basically, you want to impose relatively the same burden on offenders, irrespective of their income. And the total fine is basically multiplying the number of days with the fraction of your income.
Thank you so much, Elena, for this summary. So, talking about the comparisons between day fines and other pecuniary sanctioning models, in your article, Day Fines Should the Rich Pay More?, you assert that from a law and economics perspective, day fines should be considered as superior compared to other models. Could you maybe give us an overview of the reasons why this is the case?
So traditionally, in economic analysis of crime, first of all, as you also mentioned, fines is the optimal punishment. Why? Because it doesn't cost that much, and it is believed it can deter. And you want to keep the probability low, the fine high, and you kind of fix the problem of cost of enforcement. But how do you keep the fine deterrent enough? So traditional economists would say, make it equal to the wealth of the person. This makes a lot of sense if we think about what's called general deterrence and individual deterrence. General deterrence means you punish a person in order for others not to commit crimes in the future. And individual deterrence means the punished person kind of learns the lesson and will not commit the crime again. But the problem which is created with this traditional model is for marginal deterrence. Marginal deterrence says, well, we cannot prevent probably all crimes. Even if we want, the enforcement costs are too high, then our goal should be we want at least to prevent the most serious crimes. But if you use fine equals wealth, you cannot reach it, because for all types of crimes, theft versus murder, let's say if we live in a world we don't have imprisonment, the only punishment you have is wealth, and then you cannot basically prevent harsher crimes. So a person who commits a crime, a robbery, would rather kill all witnesses to make sure he or she are not caught, right? With day fines, you have a much larger scope to punish people. And given that crimes, we have also a large spectrum of crimes from the very minor to the very severe, we want to have the scope. Here, if you take always the portion of the offender as an income, and the number of days, that's what you basically vary, you have a scope like with imprisonment, right? Imprisonment, you think in terms of months or years. Here, you think in terms of days. You have a large scope to punish a person and still to make sure different people are deterred from committing different crimes.
Thank you, Elena. So, one of the inherent and fundamental characteristics of day fines is the quantification of the daily unit as a fraction of a person's wealth, in order then to ensure that persons coming from different socioeconomic background will pay as a fine the same portion of their wealth, even without paying the same absolute amount of money. But then a question that arises from this is, what should we consider within the scope of the wealth as a basis for the quantification of the daily unit?
So here I think you can have theoretical arguments versus practical arguments. So from theoretical perspective, you should say it's the entire wealth of the person, right? Because in the society we have people who receive employment income, but we have also people who simply receive inheritance or dividends or any other assets. If you limit this to only income from employment, that means you exclude all those who receive other income, which then makes the fine much less deterrent. Or in the extreme case, if you have a person who lives from inheritance money and doesn't have any employment, their fine will be always zero, right? Because no matter how many, the number of days, the fraction is zero. That's why if you think about deterrence and you want to really, in a way, tailor the deterrence to the different sizes of wealth and types of wealth, you would increase the scope to everything the person has. This is in theory. Now when we move to practice, the question if the specific country first has access to all the information, in some countries you do have. The tax report can actually include everything the person has. But if a country doesn't have such access, or if this information is scattered across different authorities, this becomes very complicated. And from practical perspective, some countries might prefer, well, let's focus on the main income of most people, right? So you have, basically it's a choice of policy, I would say, at the end.
Thanks. We explained why legislators should opt for day fines and why those can be considered as superior to compared to other sanctioning models. But are there also limitations to day fines? Specifically, looking at the legal systems that adopted day fines, is there any story of failure from which we can learn?
Yes, I would stay away from the word failure, maybe, try and just why it didn't work. So we wrote this book about day fines, comparatively looking at the countries that implement this in the EU. And what we notice, it seems like maybe legal transplants, they don't work. So there was this model which was initially introduced in Scandinavian countries, then in Germany, and then other countries followed. But it seems that many of the countries that adopted it later, they simply took the model as is and introduced in their system without much adjustment, right? And take for the example I mentioned before, access to information is very important. It should be first legally possible, also in terms of privacy, that the laws actually allow the authorities to get to this information, but it should be also practical. So we notice in some countries that even legally allow such access, judges do not do it because it's way too complicated. So where do I get this information? How do I take into account this information? So there are many aspects if a new country introduces day fine, it cannot be just I take the model of a different country and just implement. It needs to be very carefully designed to the specific country and the specific legal design they have. So you look at, first of all, do I indeed have access? Is it practical? And I would say one of the most important things, you need to bring on board those who are actually going to be executing this. So one thing we discovered is that some judges, for example, make it backward a bit, right? So they have some fine in their mind, and then they go backwards to calculate, so how I can adjust the number of days and the unit to fit what I already thought should be kind of deserved in this case. So if we want to take seriously day fines, we need to bring on board the sentencers, right? So before the government decides, the parliament decides to implement such a system, you need to discuss with the judges. You need to kind of have their consent to do this and understanding why it's important. You also need to bring on board the public, because also something we notice, if this is not explained properly to the public, it's very easy for the media to distort ideas, right? Because sometimes you have these ridiculous fines where a person gets thousands of euros for littering, or hundreds of thousands of euros for speeding. Now, if a person doesn't understand that the fine is decoupling the severity from the income, what actually happens is people think, oh, now you're punishing the rich people. It's not about making this more fair, more equal, more deterrence. It's about simply, revenging towards rich. So I think working on the perception and understanding is very important. Designing a system which fits your system, and then making sure people understand and agree with this system. This is the kind of only way you can really introduce and make it more effective and efficient.
Thanks, Elena. So, talking about the advantages of day fines, what are the ones that you consider to be inherent to day fines, except for the economic ones that we talked about?
So there are several of those advantages. So before we talked about complications and how you achieve, let's say, optimal fine, but we can talk about why do we want to accept this fine? Because it's not only about improving deterrence. And actually, if you look at the countries that adopted this, the discussion that was before the adoption was very much about things like fairness, things like can we actually replace short-term imprisonment with fines. So when we talk about fairness, the idea is a regular fixed fine imposes harsher impact. It has harsher impact on a person who is poorer, right? Because basically, if you are poor, every portion taken from your income, that means you cannot buy more essential things. If you're richer, then the portion which is taken, if it's a small one, that means you cannot normally buy a luxury good. So in this sense, the perception is if you impose exactly the same fine, so 500 euros for a person who earns 1,000 euros is 50% of their income, but 500 euros of someone who earns much more can be 5%. And that means the punishment has a very different impact on people. So this was one of the kind of main arguments why people wanted to make it more equal, saying income should not play a role. You should kind of make it flat in terms of how do you affect the person who committed the crime. The only thing you should vary is the number of days based on is the crime severe and, let's say, criminal record of the offender. Another interesting advantage, I would say, is the expressive function of the law. So we know in criminal law, the law has an expressive function. So what you want to do by a punishment, why you also vary it based on severity, you want to show what the society feels about the crime a person commits by signaling with the severity of the crime. When we talk about fixed fine, the problem, it doesn't signal anything. In systems where you actually need to take into account income, but you don't know how. Because let's say you see a high fine. High fine can mean you have poor offender who committed very severe offense, or you have rich offender who committed minor offense. That means the fine does not signal the crime which was committed. This can be nicely fixed with day fine if it's communicated properly. Because, and for example, Sweden, what they do, the court there, they decouple the communication of the fine. So they say, this crime I impose for it 50 days, and the daily unit then simply depends on the income. So you can look simply on this 50 days and know this what reflects the severity. If it's a minor crime, it will be 10, for example. If it's a severe crime, it will be 100. So it really allows to keep the expressive function of the law. And another advantage is uniformity. I mentioned this a bit. If you have this structured model, you can actually make sure there's uniformity across judges, because judges will do the same calculation when accounting for income, So the identity of the judge or where the court is located will not play a role, right? You actually can totally automate it. You can give a legal clerk, you can create a model where you simply need to insert how many children the person has, which income, which assets, and just press a button and you have a number. So this can be really not even part of the judicial decision. The judge decides on the number of days because of the severity and circumstances and just gets a number in order to have the final fine. And maybe just the last thing, because it was mentioned in many of the countries initially, countries that wanted to get rid of the short-term imprisonment, because there is a criminology literature talking about the criminogenic effect that people, first-timers, if they entered prison, maybe are worse off in terms of criminal behavior later. They said if we make fines more meaningful, we can replace some of the punishment of imprisonment because, as I said, with this marginal deterrence, you have much more scope to use fines. So that's also one theoretical advantage. It didn't always work in this direction, so I will not say all countries that adopted suddenly had less of the short-term imprisonment, but it can help to achieve that.
Very interesting, Elena. As a conclusion of this vlog, or this episode of this vlog, I believe that it would be interesting to know a little bit more about your future research agenda. So, since you gave us a theoretical but also practical overview of day fines, what are the experimental projects that you see may arise from the study of this topic?
Yes, so for many years I investigate this topic indeed theoretically, conceptually, comparatively, and I really feel this is the time to go and start with the empirics, because there are not many studies empirical on this topic. And I assume it's quite difficult to have empirics because, for example, when you have introduction of day fines and you say, oh, I can now measure day fines versus fixed fine before and after, but many things go around this. So it's never really a clean design. So what I decided is that my current agenda, I would like to start with experimental work to test potentially deterrent effect of day fines versus fixed fine, but also I think very important to actually test the assumption, does the public really perceive those fines as fair? I mean, we talk about this, it's fair, but fairness, it's a difficult concept, right? So something I might think is fair is not something which is fair for you. So the idea will be to have a large-scale study of a representative population and try to understand what is the perception of fairness in connection to day fines of the public. And the last project, so different models, there are different models of day fines, so it's not equal. So different countries would say, do I limit the daily unit or not? Do I set a limit, which limit I set on the number of days? What is the scope we discussed about this? I would like to also examine this. Do people kind of have a optimal model in their mind? Are preferences different in different countries? And more in the future, I want to have also observational data with some more sophisticated designs to kind of tease out the causality. Do we really see the deterrence effect of these day fines?
Thanks for being with us here today, Elena. We look forward to your future research.
And thank you for the opportunity to talk about this.
And to anybody interested to know more about day fines, I would advise you to have a look at Elena's book, Day Fines in Europe, Assessing Income-Based Sanctions in Criminal Justice Systems. And to our blog viewers, we hope you enjoyed this episode as much as we did. See you next time.